Welcome to Around the Treatment Table with Jason the PT, a podcast dedicated to helping patients achieve positive and sustainable physical therapy outcomes through education and critical thinking. With over 15 years' experience working in sports, orthopedics, and complex pain, Jason has helped many patients reach their goals and live pain-free. Jason is a certified manual physical therapist, certified in dry needling, and the owner of one of Chicago's best private physical therapy practices. Welcome to Around the Treatment Table with Jason the PT.
Hey everybody, welcome to Around the Treatment Table with Jason the PT. I am Jason Hart and I will be your host on this podcast. I decided after many patients have asked me to start a podcast because they liked my explanations. They really felt like they had a lot of the gaps filled in terms of the lack of information that they've had from prior physical therapy experiences, but they really enjoyed my interpretation of how they got to be that, how they ended up having their problems, and then what we were doing to take a deeper look. So I'm dedicating this podcast to all of my patients that want that better education, want to have someone that critically analyzes what's happening with them, takes that deeper look, so they can get the outcomes that they've been looking for, and unfortunately haven't gotten to this point. So before I go too far, a little bit about me. I did my undergraduate at Syracuse University, where I got a bachelor's in health and exercise science. I then went to Mass General Hospital Institute of Health Professions in Boston to get my doctorate in physical therapy. After that, I worked for Harvard Sports Medicine, mostly with the track and field, swimming and diving, cross country, football teams, and even the squash team. After that, I moved to Chicago, where I worked for a couple of corporate physical therapy offices. I worked for two doctors' offices before I started Core Physical Therapy, which is downtown Chicago, with a couple locations in the West Loop, as well as Lincoln Park and one in Glenview. I started this company mostly because I was tired of being a slave to the metrics. I didn't feel that was a real accurate representation of success. I mean, it was the company's success, but it wasn't necessarily the patient's success. And there's a good balance there. I found that once I started pursuing my certified manual physical therapist certification through NIOMT, I was getting some great results. I mean, I was able to start piecing together kind of the larger patient picture. And being able to kind of figure out what was really going wrong with them. In doing so, patients actually got better faster, which meant less visits. And I readily tell people after a year at that particular corporate location, they decided to take me out of it, saying I wasn't a good facility manager, I wasn't meeting the metrics. And then they stuck me up at a doctor's office in Northern Illinois, working with patients that had spinal fusions and whatnot. And that was kind of my break point right there. I actually had considerations of leaving the profession because I couldn't believe that this is really what physical therapy was. We celebrated the therapists that had the patients in the office the longest, and those are the ones that made it up through the ranks, but they weren't always the most talented ones. That inverse relationship always kind of bothered me. That's not how this is supposed to work. And I really kind of got upset by that. So I had spoken to my grandmother, and she was in her 80s, and she said, I'm not living forever. I'm going to leave you, a little bit of money, nothing much for, probably enough for a couple months rent and some TheraBands. And actually my mom, she bought me my first table that I've used to this day. And so far, it'll be about 10 years that I've been working in private practice for myself. And I made the commitment, in starting the company that I wanted to just do the good work, do the good work, get the patient the outcome that they want, have them write you a good review, and you get your volume by being the good guy, not by trying to string out plans of care. And unfortunately, I feel as a profession, we've moved too far away from the science, the good care, and moving into what's marketable, what we can talk about, what fits into a soundbite or a TikTok video. Um, but unfortunately, that behavior has consequences. I can't tell you how many patients I've had over the years that have had problems they've been dealing with for years, and they've gotten incomplete care, which has, okay, maybe improved their symptoms a little bit, but not getting them the sustainable outcome. So now you have patients that are otherwise healthy walking around feeling like they're just another float in the broken people parade. And that has some real consequences. And the one guy, and I'll share this story before I get into what I want to talk about today, that really he's like the definition of us doing it wrong and not being comprehensive. And he was a gentleman that was in his mid 30s, and he had some significant upper back pain. I'd say some atypical back pain. Uh, it was sharp shooting, a little bit burning. He had multiple X-rays and MRIs and imaging, and people were kind of giving me, yeah, it's a little bit of this, it's a little bit of that. He had 15 visits of physical therapy that was mostly soft tissue work, exercise, and stretching. And he did that for 15 visits, and he went back to his doctor. His doctor says, well, he says to his doctor, I'm just not feeling the improvement, you know. And the doc's like, well, maybe you have internal shingles, something to that effect. I was like, okay, internal shingles, that's new. He says, go back to physical therapy. Sometimes it just takes time. So he does another 15 visits, and he's still not getting better, which is interesting because, I mean, that's like the definition of insanity is repeating the same behaviors over and over and over. I mean, yeah, I understand things take time, but I mean, he's not making improvements. So they said, all right, we're going to send you to this pain guy. And the pain guy says, and the patient is hoping that he's going to get a better physical therapy experience. So he went to a very large hospital that's renowned for their PT. Except this time, they're not doing physical therapy with him. They start talking to him about him having fibromyalgia, which he didn't fit not only the shingles diagnosis, but he didn't fit the fibromyalgia diagnosis either. So he said, we're going to send you into this chronic pain group. And he sat around in a circle with other patients talking about how he was just going to have to learn to live with this pain, not think about it so much. Now, this is the patient's words, not mine, but I'm hearing this and going, this is bonkers. I said, what do they do with you? So he tells me what they did. I said, but nobody ever looked at the joint level. Nobody ever got down to actually addressing the joints directly through manual therapy. And he says, no. So I worked with him for about 5 or 6 visits in terms of doing some joint mobilizations, manipulations, going to the source of the patient's pain that was behind all of this to go directly at that place versus dancing around it. And I'm happy to say that within 6 or 7 visits, like he was feeling significantly better, more so than he had in the past 7 or 8 months. That upset me, and it actually upset me even more, actually, because his wife was having some back pain. He sends me his wife, and we were, we were all together talking about this, and she was mentioning how scared that she was that he was going to have some chronic pain problem, that he was going to have to deal with this for the rest of his life at age 30 something. That's horrifying to me. I mean, he spent thousands of dollars, a ton of time, to only be told, well, you're just going to have to live with it, without ever getting kind of that deeper look, without ever going comprehensively to figure out what was actually causing his symptoms. The imaging studies weren't really showing much. So what is it? The joint dysfunction, really. But if you don't know to look at that, or you assume that you can just self-mobilize and exercise your way out of it, that's not true. Thoracic extension manipulation, then you do the self-mobilization, then you work on the spinal stability. But we skip steps there. And by skipping those steps, and then the lack of awareness moving forward on the part of our profession to stop and say, why isn't this patient progressing? And telling me, it takes time to strengthen, it takes time to heal. Yeah, that's all true, but how long? And how long do you let it go? Especially when nobody really even gave this guy a diagnosis. And what he had was basically a joint arthritis at the mid-thoracic that started to break down. It caused a little bit of a disc tear, and that was that nerve pain. Now, it's atypical, But I don't think we did a very good job there. And to kind of hear how upset his wife was and how upset he was, our behaviors have consequences. And what I want to do, is to give patients a better explanation. So I invite everybody that has questions, to email me or write into me, and let me know what you're dealing with, because I'd like to give you some insight. Just make sure you tell me how long it's been going on, what you've been feeling, what you've tried, what's been working, what's not working, and hopefully I can give you some insight or move into a different direction. Um, because at the end of the day, what I really want to get into is the muscle blaming side of this thing. That's really where I think we've moved away from some critical analysis and understanding what muscles do and don't do. Um, but just pushing the narrative that, you need to just strengthen, you need to just stretch, here's another muscle technique, a soft tissue technique. Um, because that might make some short-term improvements, but it's not sustainable if you get back to the etiology. Muscle blaming, I think, is one of the biggest problems in our profession. Is everything is a muscle. It's all over TikTok. It's all over Instagram. I mean, there's 50 million videos about, here's the 5 best exercises to strengthen your hip muscles. And I'm not saying they're bad. They're not bad. They're just misplaced. Because if you think about it for a second, muscles just don't go kablooey. When a muscle just goes kablooey, you know, either the patient tells me what they did. It was a traumatic thing. Like, I was running really hard and I slipped and fell and I pulled my, adductor muscle, my hip, one of my hip muscles. I was rearing back to kick a soccer ball and, I pulled my hamstring like that. That has a reason. You told me what you did and it makes sense. But all too often, what I'm finding in plans of care, patients are coming to me and they're like, yeah, they told me my hip flexors were tight and my glutes were weak. And I go, okay, what did they do? Stretch and strengthen. It's like, well, did anybody explain to you why that happened? Because that's not a diagnosis. I'm not saying it is part of the problem, but it's another finding. And it's another finding that requires more questions to be asked and go hunt out the source of that weakness. And we only do this in physical therapy. Like, this is the only place where it's like completely acceptable for muscles to just go, and not work. You know, when you go into a stroke rehabilitation, you know, nobody goes, oh, that muscle weakness caused that stroke. No, that's what happens when you have a stroke and the brain is injured. That's what happens to muscles, or that traumatic or excuse me, the spinal cord injury. Well, if those muscles are just functioning, that spinal cord would have been a lot better off. It doesn't work like that. Now, those are extreme examples. Those are on one side of the spectrum, but there is another side of the spectrum. So on the other side, we're talking about reflex inhibition and we're talking about segmental inhibition. And these are things that affect muscles. So I'm going to start off with reflex inhibition. On the macro scale, if you see an athlete that tore their ACL out of the field, traumatic, boom, it's gone. They can't access those muscles. They limp right off the field because all of that inflammation, all of that pain is flooding those neural channels, which are causing the muscles to not receive a signal. One is they can't get a signal out because your muscles and your joints do send signals out to the brain, to about where they are in space. Your brain takes that information, integrates it, and sends back out a command based on what you're asking it to do. So that's, again, another extreme example. But if you have any sort of inhibition, stiffness, slight discomfort, anything that's antagonizing that joint, it's going to throw it off. Okay. It's going to throw off timing. It's going to throw off the ability to receive a signal. And any muscle that crosses that joint is going to be affected by it. Perfect example, the hip. So patients come in and they said, oh, I didn't have enough hip extension. What did they say it was? Oh, hip flexors were tight. This is my favorite. Your hip flexors are tight. How did they determine that? Well, they couldn't extend. They couldn't extend the hip, and that's okay. So in physical therapy school, we learn about these things called capsular patterns. So every joint has a typical pattern of loss if it becomes affected. In the hip, the first thing that will go is hip internal rotation, followed by abduction. Those are the two top ones. So these patients that tell me they have no hip extension, yeah, they're right, they don't. But I move them into hip internal rotation. And it's shocking that literally 90+% of people that come in with can't fire the glutes and my hip flexors are tight have a lack of hip internal rotation. If you're trying to extend the hip, it has to naturally internally rotate. If it can't do that, then the joint doesn't go there. So here's my evidence. Lack of hip internal rotation is going to give you a lack of hip extension. But we just threw out there that the patient has tight hip flexors. There's no evidence of that. Because if the joint can't go there, the muscle can't go there. So you need to mobilize the joint. Reflex inhibition of the glutes. If the hip is affected because of stiffness and aberrant input, you're never going to be able to fire those glute muscles correctly because they're going to be affected. They're affected by the output to the brain that says, hey, this is where I'm at in space, and then your brain mistimes or has less ability to recruit those muscle fibers, and there you go. Muscle weakness. Muscle weakness, it isn't a primary. It's a primary if you had long COVID or disuse or any of that stuff, but it's readily apparent. I was in bed for 6 months, couldn't get out of bed. Okay, weakness. And it's global. It's a global phenomenon. So we can't just say tight hip flexors. We can't just say weak glutes. We have to go find what's the source of that weakness. And we've learned that before. We just don't look at it, whether because we're too busy, we just don't think about it. But we need to start doing these things because patients are spending too much time, effort, and money without doing that. So that's reflex inhibition. That's a simple explanation as to what that is. On the flip side of the coin, the other part that people can have weakness is segmental inhibition. So every level of the spine has key muscles it goes to. And we'll take L5 and S1 because that's the most common place patients have problems. They have disc degeneration, they have arthritis, all of that good stuff. So like reflex inhibition, nerves that exit that level can be antagonized. Aberrant input coming in through the segment because of any sort of inflammation, whether that's the joint or the disc. And then it also decreases and inhibits nerve signals that go out, into the glutes. So L5 and S1 really are big feeders into those glutes. What's shocking is I ask patients, just for fun, do you get any kind of shin splints? It's not really shin splints. It's more of a muscular sensation at the anterior tibialis muscle. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, that's also L5. It's the same muscle. It's the same nerve. Everybody understands a spinal cord injury. If you get cut at a certain level, you lose the muscles below but retain the muscles above. Those are called myotones. Whatever muscles that service those that particular are serviced by those nerves are going to be antagonized. On the dermatome side or the sensory side, people talk about sciatica. That's L5S1. That's the sensory side of that nerve. So you have the motor side and you have the sensory side. So when patients are talking to me about sciatic symptoms, and that's the bad aberrant input coming in through the spine because of the nerve, falsely telling the brain what's going on. But again, if you're having patients that have weakness, you need to assess where that weakness is coming from. And I have videos along on my YouTube channel that actually demonstrate this. It's funny. I mean, it's not funny for the patient, but for me to look at this and say, okay, there's a myotomal pattern here. This guy's got a little bit of anterior tibialis weakness, and he's got massive glute weakness. So what you do is you put some vibratory input right over that segment. Just shake L5 and S1, the low part of the spine. And what it does is it decreases the inhibition. I retest the patient's glutes, boom, stronger. So weakness is not a finding. Muscle breaking down is not a common thing, unless, of course, there's a real traumatic reason for it, or there's something else going on in the background. But the explanations, and I'm going to go over these explanations through my podcast of disuse, overuse, muscle imbalances, all of this they're kind of throwaway answers for people, therapists that unfortunately don't have the time. Now, I'm going to say this now because I don't want to get in trouble down the road. But some of it is a lack of learning or the inability to integrate. I think it's not just the therapist level. I think at our level, we start to get so inundated with patients, especially at some of the larger practices. If you're seeing 10, 15, 20 patients a day, you're trying your best to fit everything in, give the patient the best care you possibly can. But let's be honest, you're bouncing from one place to another. How much thought can we actually put into it? And I think that's problematic, especially when you volumize care, because then not each patient doesn't get a good critical eye. I think also our continuing education system unfortunately perpetuates this because it's easy to say, I want to get certified for X, Y, or Z, in terms of muscle thing. And there's tons of them. There's a million different muscle things out there. There's Graston, ART, there's gua sha, there's massage, there's rolfing, there's naturopathy. I mean, there's a ton of muscle-based stuff. And patients come in and tell me I did everything. I said, no, you did the same thing over and over and over. You just did it a different way. So when that muscle goes dysfunctional, it's because it's been left out to pasture for too long, and then it starts to break down. It's more susceptible to injury in light of reflex inhibition and segmental facilitation. And if we're not looking for those things, we're not piecing together the formulaic equation as to why a patient is in my office, and we're going to talk about the different types of injury in this podcast. We're going to hit all of these things, and I'm basically going to call out some of the BS that's been going on because it's just zapping people of resources. And I think overall for the profession, it definitely is a detractor. But that's one explanation of what I've been seeing. So I'm going to be kind of dedicating my podcast to the patients that have had these issues, but finally found some level of pain relief here, that's sustainable pain relief, and there'll be more patient stories, as well as better critical analysis. So that's going to be my podcast for today, episode 1. That's the hard one. Follow me on Instagram at jason.the.pt. And you can also take a look at my website, www.jasonthept.com, where you guys can get in touch with me, send me some of your questions, let me know what you're thinking. If you want any sort of opinions, of course, they're not straight medical advice, but hey, I'm happy to kind of give you what I think. And we will go from there, but I think we're going to have a fun podcast, and hopefully I can bridge a few of these gaps in patients' rehabilitation, give you guys something to think about, as well as being able to ask the right questions when you are receiving care. So that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to having you guys listen to me at episode 2. Have a great rest of your day.